You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. I'm here to tell you the story of the 602 Club. Some may call me a liar, but this story is true. And I'm so excited to be here with my good friend, Zachary Fruling, as we are going to be talking about Braveheart in the 602 Club. How are you doing, Zachary?
I've been a little better, actually. I'm a little under the weather. I feel like eating a bowl of Uncle Argyle's really delicious-looking stew from Braveheart.
Yeah, that would probably make everything better. I think that probably cures all ails, but we're very excited to dive into this epic from 1995. And before we do that, of course, just a reminder, you can find us everywhere podcasts can be had. If you are listening and have not subscribed, please go ahead and do that. That way you'll get our episodes as soon as they drop. You can also interact with us and follow us, of course, on social media. We would love to interact with you there and connect with us at the 602 Club on Twitter, at the 602 Club TFM on Instagram. The entire network is on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can also find us online at trek.fm, and you can go over to Patreon and support the network. Means a lot to us. For everybody that does that, it means all of these shows can keep coming to you each and every week. That's patreon.com/TrekFM where you can do that. So go over there, help us out. But, I mean, this movie is one. It's super long. We have so much to talk about. But it really is something epic. And, you know, one of the things, Zach, that had attracted Mel Gibson in the first place to the script was that he felt like that it had been a while since Hollywood had released a film like this. And, you know, Hollywood had been known for epic films like Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments and something like Lawrence of Arabia. And so I just wanted to talk to you a little bit, but, you know, before we kind of dive into this, you know, this is in the vein of those films. Did you grow up watching those type of movies and those big historical epics, the big biblical epics? I mean, just epics in general that Hollywood was known for?
I have to say, before we get started, Braveheart is one of my absolute favorite movies. It's in my top 5 list for sure. I've probably seen this film at least 30 times, maybe 50, maybe not more than 50. But no, in 1995, I had never seen a movie like this. I had not seen the Ten Commandments. I had not seen Ben-Hur. I had not seen an epic film like this, and I had never seen anything on the scale of Braveheart when this came out. And it really affected me. It was such a, it almost became a lifestyle. I remember when I started, when I first watched the movie, I was working at a coffee shop, and a bunch of us from the coffee shop that worked together all went to see Braveheart together. And it became this thing we did at the coffee shop was we started talking in a Scottish accent and we'd drop quotes from the movie and we were buying bagpipe music. I mean, we were really in Scottish mode for a long time because of this movie. And it's stuck with me over the years. It never gets old. I can watch it again and again and again and always get something out of it. But I'd never seen anything like it in 1995. I just didn't watch those big epics at that point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, you know, I could crush you like a worm. Probably the best line in the film.
But Matt, you drop your rock.
That's right. But you know, it's funny because I'm on the opposite side of that. You know, I had grown up watching, you know, Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments and all of these type of epic films that, you know, Mel Gibson was thinking about when he read this script and realized this just wasn't the type of film that Hollywood had been making for a long time. You know, the size and the scope of this movie, you know, the historical epicness of it, you know, telling a story that's one that, you know, there's so much fact and fiction going on with the story of William Wallace because historically there's not a ton that is known about him, especially his life before he comes on the scene. And so, you know, it's one of those things. It's like, you know, Robin Hood, where the legend and the myth transcend whether or not everything you see is true, right? And yet, of course, this is based in reality as well.
But in a way, does it even matter? I mean, every country, every culture has its origin myths, right? And this is part of the Scottish, not origin myth maybe, but it's a legend. It's part true, part falsity. It's okay. We need our legends. We need our stories. We need our inspiration.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of this movie is that they did a very good job of looking behind the scenes at all of the information that was available, and then extrapolating off of that, right? And so, and that's what we do with any historical epic, right? We're filling in gaps that we don't know that aren't recorded in history books, especially, again, with somebody like Wallace, where we don't have everything about them documented until they kind of come on the scene. And even then, it's not as though we have a clear-cut picture of all that he was. And so I think it's pretty amazing that happens. But I think, like you said, when it comes to film, the beauty of when you do a film is that I don't know if anybody goes into it expecting that it has to be 100% accurate, right? We always know that we're coming into with the perspective of the filmmakers, as well as trying to tell a good story.
Years ago, I had read the novelization of Braveheart, which was written by someone also with the last name Wallace. And so the author of the novel was, of course, interested in William Wallace because they share names. And I remember in the introduction to the novel, the author stating that, he had no idea what William Wallace whispered to his lover in the middle of the night. But this is the story that he imagined and that he found inspiring. And it's the story he wanted to tell. And at that point, who cares if it's historically accurate? It's a good story.
Well, and I think too, one of the things when we kind of think about the epicness of this film and the scope, the size of it, I think one of the things that it was really interesting, and this is, like some of those movies from the 90s, I think of this film, of course, think of like the way The Matrix changes things in 1999. But all throughout the 90s, there are movies like this that kind of stand out that actually then begin to set a template for what movies will look like in the future. And one of the things that I think Gibson rightly does with his directorial style here is that he wanted you to feel as though you were in the action. You were in the battle scenes, that you weren't on the outside looking in, but you were on the inside looking out. And that you felt like you were viscerally assaulted almost by being able to feel what the violence was like because you were so close to it. And one of the things he mentioned in the extras was how, with creating this style, that it was actually better to cut down on some of the gore and almost you still leaving it to the imagination, right?
You can't spend it all at once, You have to use it sparingly. Exactly. And there are moments in the film that really make me cringe, like when to this day I'm no jellyfish, but like when Wallace cuts the magistrate's throat. Every time I get cringy, I get goosebumps. It's so visceral and overwhelming, and for some people the movie is really too much. It's too gory. It's too violent, and there are definitely a bunch of people that don't like the film because of that, for that reason. But I think it's just enough viscerality. Is that a word? Viscerality?
No, I think that's a great way to put it, actually. I think, again, they walked the line. I know that I believe this movie had an NC-17 rating because of the violence, and they brought it back. But in the end, as I was watching some of the extras, Gibson said he actually felt like the movie was better when you didn't go for the ultimate gore every time. That it actually helped you feel, because you didn't become desensitized to when that ultra violence happened.
Like one of the most visceral things in the film is when Wallace is being disemboweled, and it's happening, but all you see is his face, and it's an amazing feat of acting to convey that much pain on screen with just your face. And but you can kind of hear the sounds of it, and you know it's happening, and it's visceral, even though nothing's being shown on screen.
Mm-hmm. No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's one of the important things about the way this film makes the decision on what to show you and what not to show you. And I think the thing that I noticed the most is that so much of what happens then in this epic scope is the ways in which we still bring it down to the character stories. That with all of the battle scenes and the sequences and everything, those only mean something because of the time that we've been investing in the story of William Wallace and everyone around him as well.
Well, he's a really tragic figure in a way. I mean, as he's portrayed in the film, who knows what he was like in real life. But, he just wants to have Murren, and he wants to be on his farm, and he wants to raise crops and have a family. And it's tragic. He's just drawn into this political chaos, and he can't escape it. That's the destiny of his life, and that's the purpose of it. But he yearns for something simpler and better.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to put it. I noticed too, one of the big parts of this film, and I think there's a lot of important conversations I think that this film has. But I think one of the biggest is the idea of being noble. What does it mean? What does noble mean? And of course, people are actually called nobles in this film. And, Wallace says that, what does it mean to be noble? Your title gives you the claim to the throne of our country, but men don't follow titles. They follow courage. And he also says there's a difference between us. You think that the people of this country exist to provide you with position. I think your position exists to provide those people with freedom and go make sure they have it. And I love this conversation because, I was really just struck by, creating this character who is obviously fighting for the freedom of his country, but putting it in terms to which, of course, we as Americans would understand, Western society would understand, and for the fact that this would come from a Scot when, somebody like Hume is so important to the founding of the United States and his philosophical ideas on freedom. And so basically making this like, a proto-Hume was very interesting to me, because this really does bring it down to the idea, that what it means to be truly noble is not to live for oneself, but to live for others. And it's those nobles who are just, selfish jerks who are using people and just trying to get what they want that are really on the wrong side of history.
Well, I'm going to let you in on a little secret here, Matt. I'm actually a direct descendant of Edward Longshanks. Truth told.
Yeah, so this is going to be an interesting podcast.
The tax collector will be on its way, FYI. So I'll expect some coin to come my way. It's funny. I was thinking about the epic scope, and the thought that popped in my mind was that it reminds me of the Roman Empire. It reminds me of the difference between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. At a certain point, politicians, get a taste for what it's like to have power, and they get more and more and more power. And there go the virtues of the Republic. It's like Cicero complaining about the decline of the Roman Republic. That's what's going on here. Like we have, nobles that have become power hungry, and they forgot their role as public servants.
Well, and I mean, that's a great point because the Bruce says to Wallace that the nobles have much to risk, and Wallace asks, does the common man risk less? Just because the amount that they risk in the sense of like material things doesn't mean that they're risking less. They're still risking their lives for their country, for their freedom. And I think that's the thing that I was really struck by here is that there's this movie really is about the fact that we are all common men. We are a common race, which means then that, and what I mean by saying that is that there's really not a lot that separates us. There's more that makes us similar than there is that makes us different.
Well, there's something fundamentally repulsive to the American mindset about royalism, right? We don't like the idea of nobles. We don't like royalty. We don't like anything like that in America, right? So I'm curious. I don't really know. I've never talked to a Scot or a British person or any kind of royalist about their perceptions of Braveheart. But it strikes me that this film was made with American sensibilities in mind in that regard.
No, I would 100% agree with you. I think, but I also think that there is a sense of it's not really just about the difference between nobility and or a royalist type of philosophy, but it really comes to the ideas of freedom, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I think again the thing that really strikes me is the question that Wallace asks of what does it mean to be noble.
Mm-hmm.
I think that his answer of what makes one noble is basically the golden rule. Are you willing to do for others what you would want them have done for you? Are you willing to lay down your life for another, or are you going to take advantage of another and use them as a stepping stone? And that true nobility is not one who puffs up oneself, but who makes more of others than oneself, who uses their position for the betterment of all, not just oneself. And so I think what's interesting about that to me is that I think if you were to ask just anyone on the street what they think it means to be noble, my guess is that, today that would be more of the answer as somebody who is less selfish and more selfless. And, this is a point in history where, selfishness is rewarded here with the nobility, right? Because
there's no such thing as a selfish hero, right?
Exactly.
I mean, almost the definition of hero, you have to be self-sacrificing in some way.
But I think that's a really good point. And I think, where this movie kind of ties into, the larger aspects of where our best stories kind of bring us, it is that idea that we gravitate towards the hero who is willing to be self-sacrificial. I mean, I don't think that it is any mistake that this film basically has Wallace at the end lying on what looks like a cross.
Oh, absolutely, which is not lost on me. I remember in 1995, I was a senior in high school when this movie came out, and I was taking high school English, and we talked about metaphors ad nauseum. And I remember that scene, Wallace sprawled out like Christ on the cross. Well, that's a unsubtle metaphor there. It's very, very on the nose, which is what you'd expect from Mel Gibson, of course. So,
well, and I think it's also. I think it ties into this idea, obviously Gibson is answering that question of what it means to be noble. Nobility again is selflessness to the point of being willing to sacrifice oneself for others and the greater good, instead of being somebody who's willing to do whatever it takes to stay on top.
It reminds me of this basic Kantian ethical principle of not using other people as a means to your own ends, but treating people as an end in themselves. And that's what we expect about nobility. We don't want the upper class using the lower class as a means to make themselves richer.
No, I love that you bring that up because, I think that point really accentuates the idea of, if nothing has any meaning and we're all just, lost on a cosmic rock flinging through space and all of that. Well, then it's very easy then to rationalize treating anyone the way you want to, as long as you're getting ahead, but if somebody is an end to themselves because there is a value in them and there's a value in everything that's happening beyond just what's happening now, because there's repercussions. That's the type of question you're getting to ask. And that's where I think, you see this type of movie asking these type of questions where that has been lost in the sense that there are men in this film that are seeing themselves as better than other men because of what they've been able to accumulate and the titles they've been able to basically give themselves. But that doesn't really make them different. And again, Wallace asks, does the common man risk less? Basically, what he's asking, is the common man worth less just because they don't have a title?
Well, there's a fundamental tension because Wallace basically tells the nobles, your position exists to maximize freedom for other people, right? But there's a tension there. How can you live in a society where you're not a noble yourself, but have maximum freedom? And of course, that's the paradox that we in America see with the British and Scottish approach to politics, right? We want to maximize liberty, and to do that, we had to abolish a monarchy altogether and abolish nobility altogether. But there is this interesting tension, like, how do you be a noble and simultaneously have a higher position societally in some divine right kind of sense, because we're talking about nobility, which is a birthright kind of concept, but also try to maximize freedom for everyone else, everyone beneath you. But that sounds paradoxical to our American mindset.
Well, and that's, obviously comes the idea of freedom itself, and like the idea of like negative freedom, basically being freedom at all costs, that it doesn't matter what it costs anybody else for my freedom. And, which is, I think, more and more the place that our society is going. And
it's almost the difference between freedom and license or licentiousness, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great point. Which, one of the things about the film that I think is really interesting is this idea of compromise. Wallace, it's said of Wallace by Robert Bruce's father that uncompromising men are easy to admire. He has courage, but so does a dog. But it is exactly the ability to compromise that makes a man noble, which I think the question then becomes in the film, is that the case? Is compromise actually what makes us noble, or is Wallace on to something in the sense that there have to be principles that cannot be compromised? Because if everything then could be compromised, then, then nothing really in the end is worth fighting for, because, hey, it's not, is there a non-negotiable? And why is it a non-negotiable really becomes the question.
You're speaking to one of the fundamental tensions in ethics in general. If you take any given action, are there some actions that are just intrinsically right or intrinsically wrong? Or are some actions, do you evaluate them based on their consequences? Is there some wiggle room based on the situation or circumstances surrounding the action? Are there some actions where compromise is okay, or are there some actions that are that call for this strict hardline no compromise kind of approach? But as you're talking, though, it reminds me that what do we expect from politicians? I don't think Bruce's father is wrong in this case. Politics is the art of practical compromise, right? You get a bunch of people together, put them in the Senate, or, here in the United States, it'd be in the House of Representatives or in the Senate or in Parliament over in Britain. And, they hash out the issues, and, there's practical compromises run rampant. And this is what Aristotle thought about politics, that it's the art of the practical, not the realm of the ideal.
Well, and I think I think that there's something interesting then, because, the movie itself goes to, and I think this is probably something that's quite an American idea, but one that is rooted long in history. Wallace, I think, does believe that there are some things that cannot be compromised. And then the Bruce actually comes around to his way of thinking, because, he says to his father, I don't want to lose heart. I want to believe as he does, and I'll never be on the wrong side again. This idea that there are things that we believe in that can't be compromised because they are principles to which, if we compromise, we would be compromising our very selves. So I think the idea that politics itself is the art of compromise, but in politics, there still have to be principles on which we would not tread, or else we've lost ourselves completely. And I think that's the difference, is that, honestly, when the Bruce's father says that, he's used his nobility for his own gain. He's used his nobility to stomp on those below him and make himself more wealthy. And again, he's done all of these things in, I would say, a completely ignoble way. And therefore, that's the real, that's the battle of this film. And I think it's a big question, and obviously that's the huge question for all of us. What is non-negotiable in what we believe, and why is that the case?
I think what's interesting for me about the Bruce's father is that he's not trying to get the crown for himself. He's in some selfless sense, he's trying to get the crown for his son, like any father would, right? So there is this kind of loving father aspect to him that you can't, I don't think you can eliminate it away. But in terms of, where the line is drawn for compromise, for Wallace, it's obviously freedom, right? It's better to die free than live a slave. And that's the line for Wallace.
Well, and it's not just for him to be able to do so, but it's for everyone to be able to do so. To be able to, I mean, in all honesty, I think freedom is the biggest theme of the film, and the idea that Wallace portrays in the movie is that all men should be free. All men are created equal and should have, to quote, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and to not serve those above them. And I think, again, what's fascinating is to kind of see this movie as a portrayal of Scottish history, but also the fact that, you have guys like Hume and Smith who become so important to the founding of America that will kind of bring the ideals that this movie is talking about to full fruition. It really does become the question, are all men created equal, or are some men more important? And
I mean, this film obviously, I think, presumes a very John Locke notion of freedom, right? This is, you mentioned life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is a quote from our Declaration of Independence. But, Locke wrote it as life, liberty, and property ownership, essentially. But the idea that, that we're endowed with innate rights of some sort, and clearly the film invokes this notion that these are God-given rights. These aren't man-made rights. These are God-given rights.
I think it's interesting too because you talked about the idea of being a descendant of Longshanks, but
literally, it's true.
he's if you were to ask somebody who's English what they thought of him, I think the opinion would be completely different than somebody who's Scottish. So it gives you the idea of being on a different side and be able to look at things differently. And so, but when we're talking about freedom, I think this is the thing that Wallace believes is a non-negotiable, that all men, that all people should be free to be able to do the things to which he wanted to be able to do, which is to be able to raise a family, to own a farm, to earn a living, to provide for his family, provide for those around him, which is I think it's basically the American dream. And
I can't help but reflect on some of these fundamental issues in political philosophy. Like, one issue is whether rights are innate. And I think the film just presumes this John Locke notion of rights. We have innate rights. And then Wallace basically says they're God-given rights to something better, right? And, but that's only one view of rights and what politics is all about. On the John Locke view, the purpose of government is to protect those innate rights. And that's the end of the story. But the other side of the coin is that no, we don't have any rights at all. Life is what Thomas Hobbes called nasty, brutish, and short. It's a war of everyone against everyone, and it's total chaos. And I don't have a right to anything. You might take my food and conquer my government and do all the things. And it's only when we come together and agree on a political structure that we get these notions of rights. And there's no such thing as an innate right on that view. You only get rights inside of a political body. But this film, I think, just obviously presumes the former view that there are innate rights of some sort. But that's not obvious in the history of political thought.
Well, and I would say it's not obvious because, it's only obvious in Judeo-Christian values, because Judeo-Christian values begin with man being created in the image of God, and therefore those rights are inalienable rights because they're not given to us by us, they're given to us by God in virtue of who we are as his creation. And when you move that aside and say that's not the case, then yes, everything becomes suspect. Like everything just becomes about what we are willing to give one another, which is, I would say, the most dangerous place in the world to be, because then anyone can decide anything that they want, and it's really only those that are in power that are going to make the decision, you know? And so that's...
It's an interesting question whether our view of rights in general hinges on some sort of theological, God-givenness in that way. Otherwise, what's the other alternative? There are no rights, and it's nihilism, right?
Exactly.
Anything goes. War of everyone against everyone, which is what Thomas Hobbes was saying, that's what it is. It's war of everyone against everyone.
And I mean, Hobbes would agree with that, and Nietzsche would agree with that, and, that's where they just come with, and of course, Darwin would agree with that, survival of the fittest, and but I think that's the fascinating thing, right? I think I referenced in one of our previous podcasts, Tom Holland's book, Dominion, and discussing, the role of Judeo-Christian thought and how so much of what we believe is still built on that, even though we've kind of dismantled everything else with it. But we still hold to these truths that are self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? And so I love that question, and I love the tension then that gets asked if we remove that. And I think that's the tension of this film, is basically arguing through Wallace that yes, all men are created equal, all people are created equal, and therefore have these rights, and that, we should be willing to die for them because they're not something that anyone should be able to take away from us, because they're not given by man or by, some noble or a king. They're given by something far beyond us that can never be changed, that can never be affected. So therefore, our status is always sure.
Earlier, we considered the question of whether the historical accuracy of the film mattered. I think you could plausibly say that it doesn't. You could say that, even if this film is 90% fiction and we only know the slightest bit of information about the actual William Wallace, this narrative that's been created in the film or otherwise in the historical mythos of William Wallace, it has a kind of regulative function. It provides an ideal for the Scottish mindset to strive toward, whether or not it's historically accurate. You could say the same thing about rights, maybe. Do we know whether we actually have innate rights and God exists and God gave us these innate rights? Is there any way to answer that question? Maybe not, but maybe the language provides this kind of regulative ideal function to strive for, whether or not it's true.
I would argue that once you remove the reality of the, immortal being as the arbiter, then you come closer to where we are today, which is that we are seeing more and more throughout the 20th century and now in the 21st century, that more and more people are willing to discard that idea for saying that that's not the case. And
so the useful fiction component is not adequate as a grounding. Exactly, because for those concepts.
Fiction is fiction, and therefore a foundation of sand. Whereas as the parable goes, you build your house upon the rock and it stands. You build it upon the sand and it falls apart. And so, no, I think it's a really great question, though, and I think it's one that this film, again, like you said, the foundation of it is built upon the rock of that these are inalienable rights given to us by a creator, that therefore they can't be taken away no matter who says that they should be, whether it's a king, a noble, or anyone else. And, that, like you said, too, going back to these philosophers like John Locke and others, we are really... That's, even what the foundation of what we know of is built upon. Whether or not Locke holds to the specificity of Christianity, right, or Judeo-Christian thought, what he's building upon is that, whether he wants to acknowledge it or not, which is, I think, a truly fascinating thing. And it's what makes, these discussions so interesting. And I think this film's so rich because all three of these issues that we've just talked about, whether it's nobility or compromise or freedom, are the biggest questions of humanity in some ways, right? And our lives together as humans.
I'm so fascinated by what I might call the mythological component. Even in the movie, as someone who's narrating some scene says, his legend grows, right? It'll be bigger than before. There's this legend that's being built about him, and I have an affinity for epics. I like Homer's Odyssey, and I like Dante's Divine Comedy, and I like these big epic stories. Those are the ones that speak to me in some narrative sense. Those are the ones that I feel inspired by. And, we need those, right? Here in America, we've got our Christopher Columbus and we've got our George Washingtons and we've got our legendary figures too, our national, mythological figures, which have some historical reality, but definitely have a bit of, Americana that we've imbued them with. And then that's, William Wallace obviously serves that function for the Scots. And, that's a good thing, right? That gives us a sense of who we are. That binds us together as a people in some tribal narrative sense that we need.
Well, I think the best of the people that we look up to remind us of the best of who we can be.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But at the same time, just having read Chernov's biography of Washington and his biography of Grant, being reminded that also understanding the faults of our heroes as much as the good in our heroes is very important, because it allows us to not just idolize, but to see, okay, where were they wrong? And I think that's the interesting thing about, I would say, mythology, is that it can only go so far, because it becomes so much more about hero worship than actually giving us the good, the bad, and the ugly, which is, one of the things if nobody's ever read, the actual Bible, King David, good, the bad, and the ugly of the character, right? Seeing the reality of this man, and that he's called a man after God's own heart, but also commit some serious atrocities too, and things that we would consider even wrong today. So I think that there's an importance for us to not look at our characters and not be able to see their own faults. And I think that's one of the things, like as you were talking about the myth, I think that's one of the things that Gibson does really well with the character of William Wallace here, is he doesn't allow us to see this man as only just a hero, but he's got his own foibles. The way that he basically starts this whole rebellion is by taking revenge, taking everything.
Not an admirable trait, yeah.
No, not, right? There could have been a better way to do this. And so I think as glowing of a picture we get in the film through kind of this mythological understanding of William Wallace, I think there is also seeing where, the character has his faults. And, part of that too is we talk about like the mythology of it. We already mentioned, the documentation on Wallace's life is not extensive. And so we know kind of the bare bones about things. We don't know the nitty gritty like we do some people in history. And so building this out, I think, is really interesting. And therefore, I do think in some ways, for what you're saying, this is not a fairy tale version, but this is more of a historical fiction version of a true life character. And we're, accentuating the details, which again, as we talked about before, there's nothing wrong with. That's part of filmmaking in general.
You and I have talked previously about what I would call a postmodern turn in contemporary culture within the last 50 years or so. And, for most of the last, couple thousand years of history, it was kind of hard to separate mythology from actual history, right? It was easy to intertwine the two, whether biblically, as you're describing, or whether it's, a historical perspective on the fall of Troy or whatever it is, right? History and mythology were intertwined in some way. And as we start to do a deeper dive into these actual historical characters and expose their character flaws and look at the minutiae of their lives and kind of deconstruct the mythological component of those characters, you could say there's I guess maybe it's a question, is some damage done to the narrative mythological component of those historical figures insofar as you humanize them? It's a good thing for history for sure, because you want history to be accurate. But is there kind of a deconstructive aspect of systematically deconstructing our necessary cultural myths?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you asked earlier, whether or not we can have the almost basically the fruitful lie, the beneficial lie.
Useful fiction, yeah. Mm-hmm.
The useful fiction. And I think that the useful fiction actually turns out to be more damaging than helpful, because I think that the most important thing is for us to be able to see things as they really were. Again, just kind of reading the biography of Grant and getting a chance to see, I think, the dark side of not necessarily Grant himself, although, he was no saint, but seeing that period of history and the reality of what things were like, especially in the South after the Civil War. I think having that exposed allows us to be able to see the good, the bad, and specifically the very, very ugly, right? And I think that's one of the places where as we look honestly at those things in history, we're not allowed then to create heroes out of actual villains. And I think that's a really important thing.
So this is one of my favorite films, and it's a precious film to me. This is, like I said, it's in my top 5 easily. Maybe it's in the top 2 or 3. And I realized recently, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this whatsoever, but I was recently watching an interview with a participant in the January 6th insurrection here in the United States. And the person said something that I thought was greatly disturbing. They cited Braveheart. They said it was like Braveheart. We were storming the Capitol. And it's almost like Braveheart has become this symbol of I don't even know how to describe it. It bothered me that a film that I hold so dear could be used for such a purpose as the January 6th insurrection. They cited it as their Braveheart moment, Is that a common way of thinking about Braveheart these days, or is that just a crazy guy with his own take on the film, or has that become a kind of just a reverse revisionist history of the importance of this film?
I think that is somebody misunderstanding and misusing something. I mean, look, this story is it's just you're comparing apples and oranges, right? I mean, there's
obviously they don't understand the film. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I'm just saying, to use it that way, you're talking about a character in this film who has no representation in the governing body of England that's oppressing them, right? Mm-hmm. This is not the way our system works. And I think it's always just dangerous to be able to really talk in this language of an us versus them in this type of way when we do have representation. You just need to keep your representation accountable. And, that's a whole other subject. But I do think that's a misuse. But that's one of the things about I think the mythology aspect, as you were mentioning, when we only see something as a mythological type of figure and we miss the reality and the understanding of the humanity, right? It allows us to be able to, I think, do those type of things. again, I just as a quick reference, King David, the Bible does not shy away from any of the ugliness of his existence and his choices, right? So I'm not allowed to make him a mythological character if I actually read and understand what this man did.
Hey, couldn't have you tried? Yeah,
exactly. So, and I think that's the thing, when we, I think maybe the best answer to your question of whether or not the chipping away at the quote unquote mythology of our understanding of history is a bad thing. No, I think it's a good thing, because I think the more we understand, the better it is to either see that, one, maybe there's nothing new under the sun, but two, it allows us to be able to, if we really want to learn from history, we need to understand it as fully as possible, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think, this film gives us kind of more of the rose-colored glasses version, but in the end, too, this is a film, this is not a history book, and that's where the difference does come in, even though films, of course, have a massive influence on how we think about historical figures.
It's almost more inspiring to realize that deeply flawed people can do immensely inspiring things in this world. And, yes, the film does paint William Wallace with rose-colored glasses, but not really. He still slits the magistrate's throat, and he's pretty, he has his flaws, and it's, he's not an ideal character in a lot of ways, so... But he's sympathetic, I love that they intertwined it with a love story. I'm a romantic, and this movie is part. This, like I said, this movie came out when I was in high school, so at the tail end of my formative years. But this definitely appealed to my romantic sensibilities at the time, and still does.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the things, and I wanted to talk about this because I think it's important. I think the cast in this movie is phenomenal, and I do think that the premier cast member here of Mel Gibson playing William Wallace, I don't know if there is anybody better in Hollywood to be able to portray, just with his face, all the emotions, whether it's love, pain, betrayal, hurt, anger, frustration. I mean, he does it all. And he's given the opportunity in this film to go the complete gamut of emotions. And so many times it has nothing to do with words that he says. It's just about the expression on his face. And I think the pinnacle scene is that one where he pulls off the mask of the Bruce and realizes that he's the one who betrayed him. And Gibson just kind of falling to the ground and looking completely bewildered and betrayed and hurt. The anguish that's on his face is so perfect. And I think that's one of the things, like you were talking about this film being one of your top 5. And honestly, I think that if it's anybody else, I don't know if this would be in your top 5, just because Gibson's portrayal is 100% perfect.
Well, I think there's two components to it. I think on the one hand, Mel Gibson is one of those rare gems of an actor who can portray, like you said, the full gamut of human emotion non-verbally. All you have to do is look at his face and he can convey all that. But as a director, he had the ability to read between the lines of the script and figure out what those moments were.
That's a great point. And I think you're 100% right. And I think, too, one of the things that helps him, and I was watching behind the scenes, and everybody that was on the film talked about him as the director, and, that he is a actor's director. He would allow them to have as many takes as they wanted to get what they thought was the right one. Whereas Gibson would take like 2-3 takes and he was done. And, there were other people on the set having to be like, Mel, you can do another one if you want. You don't, it's okay. But that he was sure of himself in his understanding of what he needed for the scenes for himself, but allowing the actors that time. And I think that's really important, actually, because, Catherine McCormack as Murren does not get a ton of screen time, but her presence, because of the way she's portrayed, permeates the rest of the film, which is, it's genius in casting, but it's also an incredibly good, brilliant performance.
Yeah, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of, it's a bit of a stretch maybe, but it reminds me of what Ricardo Montalban had to say about Star Trek II. He's not actually on screen very much, but he's always present in the movie, even when he's not on screen very much. And I think her character is exactly like that. She doesn't get much screen time really, but she permeates the entire film in Wallace's mind and sensibilities and desires and what he wants out of life.
I think that's an incredible pull. It is a great 1-for-1, right? You know, absolutely. I think Khan has about the same amount of screen time, if not a little bit more. But the fact that he's always in the background is incredible. And of course, you know, Gibson finds ways to work her in even after she's died a little bit. But the fact that she is the one who has kind of helped drive this by her being taken away from him is, I think, such an incredibly important part of the film. And again, I think it just comes down to her performance, but it also comes down to the chemistry between her and Gibson when they are on screen.
You know, I actually wrote a blog post about this very topic. I think I titled it something like "When Dreams Are Better Than Reality." And there's a dream sequence when Murren appears to Wallace, and he basically says to her, "I don't want to wake up. I want to stay here with you," right? And that's the thing that's so tragic about his character is like no matter how good reality gets, even if he were victorious in this political quest he's put himself upon, life is still not going to be the way he wants it to be. He just wants to be there with Murren, and she is his ideal in some sense. Unachievable because she's dead. Right?
Yes, no, 100%. You know, and I think on the other side, when you have Argus McFadden playing Robert the Bruce, it's another great casting choice because there's a lot of strength in that character. But I think I love the way in which he plays his own indecision as he's wrestling with, you know, all of the thematic elements that we've been talking about. I think he does a great job of portraying, in not so many words, the thought processes that he is going through that will lead him to the end, right? To actually be the one who is narrating the story, right? And I think he does just a phenomenal job in that. Because again, too, he's not on screen all that much.
You know, his character is the only character that really has an existential burden of choice, right? And Wallace's character is, his fate is laid out for him. His character traits lead him to the path that he's led on. There's no actual choice for him to make. That's just the direction his character leads him to. But Robert the Bruce has a choice, right? Which direction to go. And I think we almost relate to him a bit more because that's the burden we all face. What direction do we go in life? And we're the ones who face these hard issues. We're more like Robert the Bruce than like Wallace, I would say, the lion's share of us.
Well, and I think, you know, the places in which we connect more with the Bruce is that we're raised, most of us, more like the Bruce. You know, we're not a child of tragedy. You know, Wallace
not in this day and age. You know, we live in a pretty cushy day and age. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, Wallace himself has the ability to, I think, act more quickly and being willing to find what it is that he truly believes in that's a non-negotiable, because he's been forced to do that from a very early age. Whereas, like you said, that's the Bruce has a very cushy life, you know, and comparatively. And so,
yeah, he could take his lands and titles from Longshanks and live a comfortable life. He doesn't have to take up the sword.
Yes. Which, you know, Patrick McGoohan is Edward the Longshanks, man. Talk about an incredible villain performance. And he just sinks his teeth into every moment that he is allowed to be on screen and just comes off, of course, as completely despicable for the film. But he's brilliant at it. Like, he's just, like, because you hate him and then at the same time you're loving him on screen.
Well, you understand him too. I mean, you know, he's king. It's his job to, you know, conquer other lands, and it's his job to to quell the rebellion. So he's not being a bad king in that sense, right? He's not looking out for his people, but he's doing a lot of kingly things.
Well, and I just think he does it so well. And I think he's the ultimate example in the film of the one who lives selfishly, who sees everybody else as though they're his stepping stone. You know, he
including
does not
his own
see,
son. Absolutely.
Exactly. Exactly.
As opposed to Robert the Bruce's father.
This is true. There is an interesting juxtaposition between those two characters in the sense that the Bruce's father is seeing this as a way to ensure his legacy, but also ensure his son's legacy, their whole family's legacy. It's not just about him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, no, I think that's a really interesting point.
I hadn't thought about that before today, but it you know, there's a tendency to probably lump them together because they're both, you know, royalty and nobility, and they're both fathers and whatnot, but they're actually quite different characters.
No, I think it's an excellent point, and I think that it allows us to be able to kind of see the nuance of some of the things that we were talking about earlier. You know, again, the Bruce's father is not wholly evil, and yet we could still maybe say that the choices of, you know, first principles are maybe a little askew, right? And that still is important.
You know, there's a, you know, we're not talking about this much on the 602 Club, but, you know, we just finished recently watching season 3 of Star Trek Picard, and there's a line that Riker gives in Star Trek Picard when he says, you know, you look at your newborn son, you'd burn the world to save them. And there's something noble about that, but that's what Robert the Bruce's father is doing, burn the world to, you know, help his son out.
Yeah, it's an excellent pull. You know, I think too, Sophie Marceau, who plays Isabella, the princess, also does a phenomenal job here in this film. Especially, I know this is one of her first big American productions that she's in, but I think she's so wonderful in a position to which she makes the most of every opportunity to do the right thing, even though it could cost her, right? She's playing a very dangerous game. And at any moment, she could be caught. And I think she does it so well. And the vindication at the end where she, you know, tells him that, you know, your line will end quickly.
And he coughs up a lung,
phenomenal.
Right then and there, like I was last night.
Exactly.
I sounded like Edward Longchanks last night. I really did cough and get a lung late at night. You know, I think Murren is a tough act to follow in Wallace's mind. And, you know, here comes what's her name? Isabella France, right? And there's something of Murren's spirit in her that Wallace recognizes, but I find that interesting that, you know, when Wallace's mind is so set on Murren that somehow Isabella comes along and speaks to him in the way that's reminiscent of Murren.
I think that the thing that really attracts him to her is the fact that she is willing to do the same thing that he is doing on the opposite side. And part of that is, I think that she's also the way that the Bruce is attracted to the strength in Wallace, the principles in Wallace. She's attracted to that as well. And I think the movie is showing us that one principled man can make a difference if it inspires others to follow his lead, which is, of course, the entire story, right? Because the Bruce follows Wallace, and, you know, he spends, I think, the next 13 years working on making sure that Scotland is actually free. And it's a hard-fought battle. He loses his castles. I've read a really interesting biography of him, and it's a fascinating story, but he takes those principles and runs with them, and he is willing to give his life for them. And so, no, I think she portrays somebody that is able to see that strength in him and then actually returns that strength right to him. And like, she sees it and she reflects it back. She's able to do the same thing. And especially since it's at great personal cost to her. At any moment, she could be found out and she would be executed.
And as a woman in that time period, she's subordinate for a number of reasons, right?
Exactly.
But she still manages to take that subordinate position and use it for a noble purpose.
Yes. No, it's a great point. So, one of the things I think that we have to talk about in this film is the music. And this is a score by James Horner, who Star Trek 2 and 3 fame, did, Aliens. And I mean, he's an incredible composer. But this hauntingly beautiful score may be one of his absolute best. And I don't think the movie would be the same without this score.
There aren't too many soundtracks at that time period that I bought on CD, if you remember buying soundtracks on CD, but this is one. I rushed right out and bought the soundtrack on CD.
Yeah, my first soundtrack was Jurassic Park. So,
really?
That was my very first CD.
I think it's probably the first soundtrack, yeah. It's funny because for me, it really did spawn this whole Scottish Renaissance music-wise. I remember I'm in California here, and I went to the Scottish Games in Pleasanton, California, and bought Scottish music and watched the pipe bands and watched them do the caber toss. I was such in the Scottish mode for about a year after this movie came out, and I was actively buying bagpipe music as a result. And that's not directly a result of James Horner's score per se, but the movie was very, very. It had its own sound. It was a total unity between the film and the score, I think, in this movie in a way that you rarely get.
No, I completely agree. And I think one of the beautiful things about the score is that it works exquisitely inside the film. But I think it's also one of those that I enjoy listening to outside the film. And, to me, those are the types of scores that live on forever because it's one I want to go back and listen to. I listen to this one frequently. And part of that is the hauntingly beautiful nature of the love themes, the beautiful pep of the bagpipe music, as we're telling the tales, as well as the, I think the visceral nature of the battle sequences.
I was watching a movie. I'm trying to remember exactly which movie. I think it's Field of Dreams. I'm not 100% sure on this. But there's a scene when, in that film, when the main character is walking through the cornfield and you get this kind of fluttering sound. And I listened to it and I went, that sounds exactly like the thing from Braveheart. There's a kind of fluttering motif that you get at some point in the score. And I looked it up, and sure enough, James Horner reuses a lot of his music. And I didn't realize that this is one of the controversies with James Horner, that he tends to reuse his music. And he's received a bit of flack for that as a composer. I think for bad reasons. Why not dive into your own well? I don't understand what the controversy really is. But I do remember vividly watching, I think it was Field of Dreams, and I said, that sounds like Braveheart. Sure enough, it was, I guess Braveheart, let's see, Field of Dreams must have come first before Braveheart, right?
I think so. I'd have to look it up. I'm not as familiar with. I've seen Field of Dreams a couple of times, but it's not one that I know like the back of my hand. But no, you're absolutely right. If you listen to Star Trek 2, you will hear things from Aliens in that film, and so there are definitely phrases that he has. But I mean, Williams is the same way. There, after so many, so many years of doing scores, there are going to be bits and pieces.
Things that just work. Yeah, right.
Exactly. So, well, honestly, this is a film that you could probably talk about for as long as the movie runs. But with everything that we've talked about, I don't think there's any question, but I do have to ask you, what you would rate Braveheart.
Matt, I have nothing to say bad about Braveheart. Like I said, it's one of my favorite films of all time. I've watched it more times than I've watched almost any other movie, I think. There's a total unity of script and acting and music. And for me, it's epic in scope. And for me, this was the first epic I ever watched. It started a new renaissance in epic filmmaking. We've delved into the depths of its meaning, revolving around freedom. So this is one of those rare movies I will give 5 out of 5 stars, but let's call it 5 out of 5 screams of freedom.
I think, you mentioned the idea that this is a film that kind of reignites the epics. And I don't think we would have movies like Gladiator and other films of that nature
Troy, we wouldn't have anything like that.
All of those films, owe the fact that this film did so well and became such a hit. I'm going to give this 5 out of 5 spears twice as long as a man because it is a perfect film. I agree with you. I don't think that there's anything I would change about it. And I loved rewatching it. And goodness, I tell you what, the 4K version of this film looks so gorgeous. And if you don't want to visit Scotland after watching this movie, you're probably dead inside. But Zach, if people wanted to catch up with you, see what else you've got going on, where would they catch up with you?
Yeah, there's 2 main places. You can find me on my blog, just zacharyfruling.com, and you can always follow me on social media, especially on Twitter. My handle is just @ZacharyFruling. Easy to find.
And you can find me all over social media with the name Matt Rushing02, the places I am most active, and I'd love to connect with you all over on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, or Vero. You can also find me, of course, outside the 602 Club with a bunch of shows, Literary Treks about the books and the comics of Star Trek, The Orb about Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Warp 5 about Star Trek Enterprise, Saddle Up about Strange New Worlds, which is going on right now, and The Artificial Tango about Star Trek Picard. You'll find me over on the Nerd Party Network as well with 2 shows. One's completed. It's called Owl Post. Every single chapter of the Harry Potter series is covered on that series. And then you'll also find me on Aggressive Negotiations with John Mills as we talk about Star Wars each and every week. But thank you so much for joining us. And freedom!
Freedom! Thank you.